What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we dive into 5 brews I threw together for the new set Phyrexia All Be One. I have yet to playtest these as I didn't have early access like some other content creators did, but these are some ideas I'm kind of throwing together, seeing if they are possibly going to be able to be played once Phyrexia launches, I believe, next week on Arena. But these are some interesting ideas I kind of threw together based on the cards and kind of felt what decks could work with the possibility of some of the new mechanics when it comes to the new set. With that being said, let's just dive into the decks and let's just start talking about them. So the first deck we're working with here is going to be a Dimir Proliferate deck. This is a deck idea that I kind of saw someone play, but I figured I'd get my own take on it. This is kind of playing around the new Proliferate ability plus poison counters, as there are some spells in the blue and black that put poison counters on your opponent just from playing a spell, and you don't even have to deal damage to them to do so. And the idea here is what we're trying to do is trying to keep control of the board and kind of hopefully proliferate up our poison slowly throughout the game. We also have some creatures in the deck that also will put poison on our opponent. Like the first card we have here is the Skull Dweller, 1 mana, 1/1 with Death Touch and Toxic 1. So if we can get through at least one swing with this, we're going to at least start a poison counter there. We also have Blight Belly Rat, another card in here that is a 2 mana 2/2 with Toxic 1. If it dies, we proliferate. So a decent card that if we get that one poison, if this leaves the battlefield, unless it gets exiled, we're going to be able to proliferate that poison counter on our opponent. We have cards in this deck that also take advantage of us having 3 or more poison, with cards like Anoint the Affliction, a card that's going to benefit in the later game as they go up in poison, as it initially exiles target creature with mana value 3 or less. If we have 3 or more poison, it's going to exile creature instead, which is definitely very good. We have Drown in the Ichor as a nice 2 mana removal spell that gives target creature -4/-4, and then we proliferate. We have cards like Experimental Augury, a card that's going to basically let us look at the top 3 cards of our library. We put one of them into our hand, the rest in the bottom of our library in any random order, or in any order, and then we proliferate as well. We have Prolonged Phyrexia. It's a card that's for 2 mana at instant speed. We get to draw a card and also put a poison counter on our opponent. We have Scheming Aspirant, a card that's going to just help us benefit from proliferating, as it's going to drain our opponent for 2 life, or we're going to gain 2 life. We have Distorted Curiosity, a card that gets cheaper if we have 3 or more poison. Essentially, it's a 1 mana draw 2 at that point. Also, we have Infectious Inquiry, a card that's going to help us draw 2 cards, lose 2 life. Each opponent then gets a poison counter. We have Vraska's Fall, another card that makes our opponent sacrifice a creature or a planeswalker, and then it gets a poison counter. We have Mindscape Apparatus, which essentially is an artifact here that we can flash in. At the beginning of our upkeep, we get to put an oil counter on it, and then it makes all our instants and sorcery spells cost 1 less to cast, allowing us to play more of our cards from our hand, and it keeps on ticking up. So basically, at some point outside of the more expensive spells we have in that are not instants or sorceries, most of our cards are then going to cost 1 mana unless this is removed from the battlefield. We play Tech Thule, Inquiry of the Dominus, a 4 mana 3/5 with flying that if we proliferate twice instead, which is definitely very good. And we can give it, we can also give it indestructible if we remove 3 counters from among our other artifacts, creatures, and planeswalkers we control. And we get to put an indestructible counter on it. It's not the most necessary thing, but really what we're trying to just take advantage of is that double proliferation, and we're not really attacking in with it. And I guess worst case scenario, maybe we could minus counters from like a Vraska if we really need to give it indestructible if need be. And then the last card is going to be Vraska. It's a card that's for 0, is going to help us draw a card, lose a life, but proliferate in the end, which is definitely what we're really trying to work for. And then this is something we can also tick up with the proliferation of our other cards, and we can possibly get to that -9 if target player has fewer than 9 poison counters on them. They get equal to the difference, so they go up to 9. Essentially, is what this is saying. And then our mana base is pretty straightforward. We have some dual lands: the New Dark Slick Shores, Shipwreck Marsh, Underground River, and then a balance of islands and swamps, because our deck is kind of like 50-50 when it comes to blue and black. Definitely an overall interesting deck. Definitely a different way of playing Magic than maybe you're typically used to, as it's kind of like a control deck, but we're really just more so controlling some things on the battlefield, but really just trying to do our own strategy with poison on our opponents slowly. Overall, pretty interesting deck, I would say. So the next deck up on this list is a Tokens deck, and Tokens I do think we'll see some more play, as I do think this card, Skillgrit's Hive, a 2 mana enchantment that's beginning of our upkeep. We lose 1 life. We get to create a Phyrexian Might creature token that with Toxic 1 that can't block. I think this is going to be a card that's going to help people be a little bit more aggressive with tokens, as we can play this on turn 2, and then basically after that we're going to get Might tokens unless it's removed. And if our opponent has 3 or more poison counters on them, any creature that we control that has Toxic also has lifelink, as I think is a pretty solid card. And then combine that with things like Wedding Announcement as another way to produce tokens. And then we also have Mondrak, Glory of the Dominus, the mono white Phyrexian horror creature here that also helps us produce additional tokens, because if one or more tokens would be created under our control, we get to create twice that many tokens instead, which is definitely pretty sweet. And for 3 mana, we can sacrifice 2 other artifacts and or creatures and put an indestructible counter on it. Maybe this is something that we'd probably want to do that with, as this is probably definitely a target your opponent's definitely going to want to target with things. Outside of that, all we have in the deck to kind of mitigate some of our life loss due to the Hive is going to be Luminarch Veteran here as a card that is going to basically help us gain that 1 life every time one of these come into the battlefield. If we have a Mondrak out, we're going to gain 2 life and only lose 1, so we're going to actually net 1 additional life, which is definitely pretty sweet. We have Bring the End In, a card that's going to hopefully mitigate the early game by counter target spell unless its controller pays 2. If we get our opponent to 3 or more poison, we're also going to be able to just counter spells straight up for 2 mana, which is definitely pretty sweet. We have Intrepid Adversary to pump the team. I think this is a pretty interesting card in the deck just because it's a card that you can sink mana into. It's going to pump even our little tokens that maybe 1/1 mites, and then create those little 1/1s to be something your opponent's going to really have to think about dealing with, just because they're going to be maybe 2/2s or 3/3s. Serum Snare to bounce something back in case we either want to prevent one of our things from getting hit, or if we want to prevent, we just want to get rid of something that's taken one of our things, but definitely a cool card. And if we target a permanent that's mana value 3 or less, we get to actually proliferate, which helps us out. We also play White Sun Twilight, another interesting card here that we would gain X life, create X 1/1 Phyrexian Might artifact creature tokens, and if X is 5 or more, we destroy all other creatures. That seems kind of weird. It seems kind of productive for a tokens deck, but this is definitely kind of one of those things that if we have like a Mondrak out combined with this, we're going to create 10 tokens for 7 mana, which is definitely not bad if we get to that point. NX Sentry is a card that we added to the deck. I think this deck needs a little bit more interaction with what's on the battlefield. This is a decent card to interact with artifacts and creatures that cost mana value 3 or less, as it kind of works as our Brutal Cathar for the deck. And then Malkor is another card that works very well with this deck. The 3 mana 1/1 that when it enters the battlefield, we create a 3/3 Phyrexian Golem artifact creature token. And at the beginning of our end step, if 3 or more artifacts have entered the battlefield under our control, we get to create a 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Golem. And this is definitely an interesting thing, as you have things like maybe the multiple hives you have out, or 1 hive combined with Mondrak is definitely very good there. And then if you're able to get something else out to create additional artifact like this, you're definitely going to be able to trigger that and get additional golems, which is definitely pretty sweet. And just to make the team very beefy, especially the artifacts, we have a couple copies of Urza here, just another creature here that's going to buff our artifacts we control to give them +2/+2. And for 6, we can copy 1 target artifact we control, except it's a 1/1 soldier in addition to its other types. So we can copy any of our creatures on the battlefield to maybe pump out additional threats. But overall, very interesting deck that I feel like is definitely pretty aggressive when it comes to creating tokens, and definitely seems like a fun deck that once it starts going off, it's definitely going to be a fun one to play with. The next deck up on this list is going to be Boros Tokens. This is another very interesting deck that I could see, seeing some play, as I do think this has 3 good ways of making tokens outside of the Hive. We also have Wedding Announcement in the deck. We also have Urbra's Forge, a 3 mana artifact at the beginning of our combat. We put an oil counter on it. We create an X1 Might creature Phyrexian horror creature token with trample and haste. Based on how many oil counters that are on it, and then we sacrifice at the beginning of our next end step. You combine this with like a Mondrak, another good way to produce additional tokens that can attack immediately. Another card that I think is pretty cool with this deck is going to be the All Be One. This is a card that whenever we put 1 or more counters on a permanent or a player, All Be One does that much damage to target opponent, creature, opponent controls, or planeswalker that opponent controls. So overall, a card that's going to put pressure not only on your opponent's life total, it's going to put pressure on maybe pinging off their creatures slowly, kind of like machine gun effect. And this essentially counts any sort of token. It doesn't need +1/+1 tokens. It counts the indestructible token that you put on Mondrak. It counts the token that goes on Wedding Announcement every time that ticks up. The oil token, the tokens that go on Bankbuster when it comes into the battlefield, the tokens that go on the sagas as they tick up as well. Definitely a lot of ways to put tokens on things, and I do think that's a pretty effective thing. And based on how many tokens that is, it does that much damage. So if you have a Bankbuster, it's going to do 3 damage. All these other one-off tokens will do 1 damage, but that's still pretty effective, I do think, when it comes to that. We also have a Flamestoker here, another interesting card from Phyrexia that whenever we cast a non-creature spell, our deck is, on the most part, non-creature spells with like a handful of creatures, I would say, for the most part. And this is going to get a oil counter, and then for 7 mana is the initial ability. We sacrifice it, we discard our hand, and we draw 4 cards. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each oil counter you have on it. So this is another card that helps us dig aggressively into the deck, especially in the early game if we're really looking for answers. But I do think this is another solid option if you're looking to play some tokens, as I play some of the new cards. And I do think this deck could be pretty effective and pretty aggressive when it comes to overwhelming your opponent with the tokens that it could produce. If you're liking the content on the channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It definitely helps out a lot. Also, if you want to go the extra mile, you can simply click the join button. You can join the channel and become a member for as little as $1. That will also help support the channel. The next deck up we have here is going to be Gruul Aggro, and this is definitely another interesting list that I do think makes green and Gruul better, as there's a lot of interesting Phyrexian cards that are in these colors that help make this deck that much stronger. I think the first one being is the Evolve and Adaptive. It's a 1 mana card that gets an oil counter or comes onto it, and it gets +1/+1 for each oil counter on it. And then whenever a creature comes into the battlefield under our control, if it has more power and toughness than this card, it gets an additional oil counter, and then it goes up in power. You combine that with, say, like Aquarian Beastcaller or another card that whenever we cast a green spell, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on it. So they both pretty much trigger off each other. And then if it dies, we get to distribute those +1/+1 counters. We have Bloated Contaminator, a card that is Trample, Toxic 1. It only costs 3 mana. It's a 4/4. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we Proliferate. Fable the Mirror Breaker makes an appearance. We got Meaglaws, the Maze Crusher, 3 mana 4/4, and just battlefield 5 oil counters on it. 1 mana, we can remove an oil counter from it, give it Vigilance and Trample, or Vigilance and Menace into end of turn. We can remove 2 counters from it. We give it +2/+2 at end of turn, and we can remove 3 counters from it. And we get Destroy Target Artifact or Enchantment. Definitely another solid card for 3 mana. Definitely very good. We also have a couple copies of Urbrass Forge, just another way to keep on putting pressure on our opponent. Also gets oil counters on it. Evolve Spinoderm is a 4 mana 5/5 that comes to the battlefield with 4 counters on it. If it has Trample as long as it has 2 or fewer oil counters. Otherwise, it has Hexproof, which is definitely very solid. Can't be targeted directly by a spell your opponent may try to cast to remove it. And then at the beginning of our upkeep, if we have 0 counters on it, we have to sacrifice it, which is the one downside, but we have definitely some ways to kind of keep those counters ticking on it one way or the other. We have Halana and Elena to kind of pump our things and give them haste, which is definitely very strong for a Gruul style deck. And we also have 1 copy of Cinderlast Ravager. I'm not sure if I want to go up to 2. I wasn't sure 100%, but it's an interesting card here. It's a 6 mana 5/5. It costs 1 less to cast for each permanent we control with oil counters on it, and then has Vigilance, and then when it enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to each creature your opponent controls, so it's kind of like a good way to sweep a lot of small tokens out if your opponent doesn't have any sort of way to pump them up. Another card that I didn't really go over that's also new that I added into here is the Venerated Rot Priest. It's a 1 mana 1/2 with Toxic 1. Whenever a creature we control becomes target of a spell, target opponent gets a poison counter, so this is definitely one of those ways that if we can kind of put some poison on our opponent, we can also get them to get additional poison, so it protects itself. It gives all our other creatures that may get targeted by spells also give them additional poison, which definitely, is another way to win. And there's a lot of things in our deck that could put poison on our opponent, which is definitely very good. But overall, it's another interesting kind of Gruul list I threw together. Has a lot of the newer cards in it, some of the cards that existed prior, but overall, pretty interesting deck that I feel like could put pressure on your opponent very, very quickly. And the last deck up on this list is going to be Mono Green Bigstuff. And the idea here is what we're trying to do is ramp up into our big expensive things that this deck has. We do have some cards that we can play in the early game to kind of put some creature pressure on our opponent. We have Evolve and Adaptive, a card that I feel like we'll see a lot of play if there's green aggro decks for the most part, as it does get bigger if we play bigger creatures. We go into the Armored Scrap Gorger, another interesting card here. It's a mana producer for 2 mana. It's a 0/3. Every time it taps down, we get to exile target card from a graveyard and put an oil counter on it. We have Quarian Beastcaller, a card here that's going to get pumped up every time we cast a creature spell afterwards, and then we can distribute those +1/+1 counters if it does end up dying. We have a couple Bloated Contaminators. It's a 3-drop 4/4, Trample Toxic 1. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we Proliferate. We have Topiary Stomper here to dig into our deck to find those basic lands, to also play a 3-drop 4/4 with Vigilance, and that can't attack our block unless we have 7 or more lands. We have Evolve Spinoderm, another solid 4-drop here. It's a 5/5. It has Hexproof as long as it has 2 or more counters, or more than 2 counters, and it has Trample if it has 2 or less counters, which is definitely very good. We have Oddity that makes an appearance in the deck as just a very solid 4-drop that's aggressive. Trample Haste 4/4. And if we have 7 mana, we can transform it to its 8/8 side. We have Defiler of Vigor that pumps the team if we play creatures afterwards, which is definitely very solid, and also allows all our green spells to then pay Phyrexia mana instead of paying its actual mana, which is definitely solid as well. We have Silverback Elder in here as a one-off, just to kind of have in case we get into a matchup where we want to destroy target artifacts or enchantments when we cast a creature spell. If we want to ramp up, we can put a land on the battlefield, or we can gain 4 life. Nissa is kind of the key card in this deck, as she's going to be the card that we're going to want to drop for 7 mana. We don't want to play the Phyrexia mana for her because her -7 is probably her strongest ability. Until end of turn, creatures we control get +1/+1 for each forest we control. So if we have, mostly forest out, even if it's 6, +6/+6, +5/+5, all of them having trample and +5/+5 or anything is definitely be pretty effective and probably win the game right then and there if you have a bunch of other creatures out on the battlefields. We also included a few copies of Storm the Festival to kind of fill the board up in case of any sort of board wipe, and then there's a good chance we could always flash it back in the later game. And we have 1 Zapadril, Hunger of Dominus, a 7 mana 4/6 with reach. And at the beginning of each combat, we get to double the power and toughness of each creature we control until end of turn. Definitely, it's a one-off. It's not something we're going to definitely want to have, but it's definitely something I want to mess around with, and I think one of them was fine. But I do think, green is back in one way or the other. I do think you're going to see, if you're going to play green, you're going to want the Nissa Ascended Animist, as she's going to be the way to push green over the top, just because I feel like that's where green was lacking, as a lot of the creatures in general don't really have trample, and I do think being able to have a card that just gives all your creatures trample is going to be a way to kind of push that those final points of damage off that green didn't have beforehand. But overall, another interesting deck that I kind of want to mess around with and kind of see how it does in this meta. But with that being said, I mean, each of these decks kind of bring something new to the table. I feel like some of them, for the most part, I tried my best to play with only new cards. I do think over time we'll kind of see an adaptation of where there'll be some new cards and there'll be some cards that have already existed in Standard. And I do think that's kind of where, as the time goes on, once this is in Arena and people get to play test more, we'll kind of fine tune most of these decks. So over the course of release, I'll probably go through and probably make tweaks and things like that. Like I said, I didn't get to play with any of these decks as I wasn't part of the early access event. But as we kind of dive further, I'm excited to play with new cards. I do think a lot of these cards bring something new to the table, and I'm definitely looking forward to playing them and trying them out. But with that being said, was there anything that stuck out to you? Was there a deck that you're working on that maybe I didn't put in the video and it's another interesting idea that I could take a look at? Let me know in the comments below. If you like the video, hit that like button. Definitely helps out a lot. And if you're new here, you want to post new videos like this one here on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But until next time, I'll see you in the next video.